the big challenge for this government is to balance populism and fiscal prudence. And how do you see the finance minister go about it?
Well, I agree with that, Palki. I think populism versus fiscal prudence is entirely in the context of the electoral cycle. So depending on where you peg the national election, whether that's in a year's time, 18 months' time, possibly even earlier, that defines, I think, the messages that will come out of Arun Jaitley's statement today. So I think the leading item before you even get into those is what's the political agenda.
Jasper, your expectations?
I think I largely agree with Vivek in the sense that the conundrum here is sort of how to please people when the piggy bank is less than full. It's a bit like me at college trying to impress the girls but having absolutely no money. It's a similar thing. Look, I think here, as I said before, it's all about politics and it's all about the timing of the next election. On that front, and Mr. Modi has the best possible kind of personal barometer of popularity. Post Gujarat, when I think they had a shock, I think they'll be looking now to kind of steady the ship a little bit. The problem, of course, they have is there's absolutely nothing they can do that's going to have an impact pre-election. And so what I would be saying, Palki, is, if I was in Mr. Jaitley's shoes, is sort of neutrality. Neutrality is probably neither good nor bad, is where I'd be looking to end up from a message perspective.
So everyone's talking about it as Arun Jaitley's toughest budget and not Modi's.
Well, that's right. But Palki, you've put your finger on the big item here, which is all that the BJP will be thinking about now is how do you maintain that popularity through to the 19 election, right? That's the number one item. When we've talked about this on shows before, I'm with Vivek here. The list of things yet to do and not done, is far longer than all of our arms put together. But the only way you're going to do that is by getting at least 2 terms. And of course, the tricky thing about the weapons grade reform that this country needs is that you've got to get going in the first 2 or 3 years of the first election cycle. Then you've got to think about getting your next gig. And so I think here, I think Richard's point was interesting. I think you can signal stuff that you're going to do, assuming they get back in at 19. But right now, I think that their kind of hands are tied, because if they take a wrong step, then they'll jeopardise the second term. They jeopardise the second term, we can forget about all these things.
In fact, there seem to be very strong rumours this time round.
Don't do it.
They're going to do something. I just wish they don't.
Well, I think...
You just needly spook people.
Well, no, I agree with that in the sense of I cannot for a second imagine they're going to have a smash and grab through capital gains on the stock market boom. I mean, I think you can debate all day long whether the bull run we're on is entirely rational. But for the Indian electorate and the international community, it's good news, right? It's a rocking good story, which you don't really want to interrupt. There may well be a correction in the equity markets pre the general election, but you don't want to be the man that started that.
The world isn't paying so much for petrol. Why are we?
That's a very good question, Palki. It's one I'm afraid I'm not sure I'm qualified. I'm qualified to answer. I think, like many of these things, there's often a lag between the index price and price at the pump. So I suspect it's something to do with that, but I'll defer to our esteemed panellists. If you bring this back to today for Mr. Jaitley, warming up as we speak, I think what we can probably all agree is that the level of tax increases going forward is somewhat unknown, right? We have a dialectic here between a bull and a bull and a semi-bear here. But the dilemma he's got is, put it this way, he doesn't want to be the guy that declares that taxes are going to go up by a significant quantum. Obviously. And then get that wrong in a few months, right? I shouldn't think that would make him very popular with Mr. Shah and Mr. Modi. So that's the thing he's got to deal with now, is how does he temper that messages? And one can only assume to that extent he's got to hedge his bets, right? He's got to sit between you two. I think I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, I think where these budgets are unhelpful is they showcase a series of metrics, whether it's a deficit number or an export number. The real issue is what are the inputs that's created that output? So we look at exports here. Let's go back to a very basic thing that Meera Ma'am talked about here, which is ease of doing business. I operate businesses here. I invest in India. I operate here. I'm a sort of Desi Gora on that front. and it's extremely hard to do business. Now, the budget won't particularly talk about that today. There may be some flowery news that we're now in the top 100, though I note that we are precisely number 100. Whatever's powering our car, we've still got to resolve the issue. It's going to take us half an hour to get between point A and B, so fixing the infrastructure, kind of running before we walking before we run.
Given the posturing, given the position that the Prime Minister of India seeks to assume on the global stage, defence spending is, according to many, an indicator. Any thoughts on how much this year's figure could look like?
I can't comment on the figure, Palki. You can certainly say that this is spending on defence is a sort of subset of reassuring the voter and the Indian public that we have a well-defended nation, and that Mr. Modi is a strong leader. So I think the number is much less important than the kind of presentation and what it does for Mr. Modi's image.
You're an investor, Jasper. Do you think the government is being able to convert the global interest into inflows?
I think that they're investing a huge amount of time in publicising the benefits of investing in India. And as Ron Summers was saying, it is true that confidence is a prerequisite of FDI or really any form of business or investment. Having said all of this, and Mr. Katter and I were just discussing this, sooner or later you're going to have boots on the ground and you're going to be into the execution game. And the truth then is that we're a long way behind in terms of things like ease of doing business. And if you compare, it's a global market, as we know, and if you're sitting in, let's say, Columbus, Ohio, to take a kind of bellwether, central part of the States, what looks more appealing right now, mainland China or India? And the answer is evident. So I think we applaud the kind of publicity, we applaud Modi going to Davos. There is a cleansing of brand India that's required. But when you're here, there's an awful lot of work that needs doing, and that's nitty-gritty.
So I spoke to some people earlier who said that while policy changes and the government's intent is all fine, you have to operate in a certain environment, and that hasn't necessarily changed. Would you agree with that?
Well, on and off, we've been operating here for about 20 years. So in the context of 20 years, there have been tremendous improvements. And one forgets this, really. When I first moved to Bombay in 1995, it was a lot harder than it is now. And over the long haul, things are getting better by and large. Having said that, if you compare the operating environment here to certainly anywhere in Southeast Asia and a few other countries, there's a lot of work to do. I think if you tie this back, Palki, to the budget and government, whether it's federal or state government, the basic contradiction on a lot of this stuff is that government is the least well qualified people to sort this stuff out. And in fact, rather than lead, I think very often they should get out of the way. I mean, personally, if I look at the sectors we invest in, what's required is a massive bonfire of regulations, right? And the re-employment and gainful ways of many of the bureaucrats that are enforcing those things. So I keep coming back to the basic conundrum in this, which is there's a sort of physician heal thyself argument. If you want the physician to be government, good luck to you.
You want to?
Well, I mean, going back to the political point, 100% it has to be a political budget. I mean, they got the BJP got the shock of their lives in Gujarat, right? And as Kartikeya says, you can tie that right back to the rural voter. But nonetheless, I don't think they were expecting to settle down at 100 seats. They were expecting to do much better than that. I'll tell you what would be interesting, Palki, is what was the budget they had in mind pre-Gujarat, assuming that they romped home in Gujarat? I suspect it's a very different budget now, and what they've absolutely got to do is not risk the general election whenever that comes. So do no harm is number one policy. There are any amount of good ideas we're hearing about how to reform the economy, but in the kind of glorious and daunting enterprise of reforming India, surely power trumps politics, power trumps economics every time, and none of this means anything if they don't get back into power for a second term. I mean, none of us round the table, whatever our ideas are, could possibly reform this country in a single term. And we go back to the basics of it. Gujarat was a really nasty shock for them. I'm with Kartikeya. There are some elections coming up now. So a bit late for us to advise Mr. Jaitley, but I should think the politics of this, dominating his thinking.
Is it even a fair comparison, India and China, considering not just in terms of the size of the economy, etc., the way they approach business and governance are totally different? So can you compare?
No, it's not. This is a complete apple and orange comparison, and the orange is a very big orange, right? And the orange is 20 years ahead of the apple. So I don't think it is a fair comparison. I think, I think there are things to learn from China, their reforms and the rest of it, but of course we're very clearly operating in a very different environment. I mean, Mr. Modi wouldn't mind having some of the infrastructural mechanisms of the Communist Party in terms of execution, but whether we'd all like that might be a slightly different matter.
Do you think that is going to be one of the focus areas, spending?
Well, it might be in terms of messaging. There's absolutely nothing that can be done in this budget that's going to, have any real short-term impact in terms of infrastructure. There might be some fine words around it. I think everybody agrees. We were talking about electric cars before. Little point in us having electric cars if our roads and the infrastructure associated with are actually in good nick. So, having said that, I mean, Douglas did make a fair point, which is there have been year-on-year improvements. It kind of is getting easier to get around. So, it's not all doom and gloom.
The Prime Minister seems very inspired by what's happening in Israel, which is called a startup nation. But what are we doing here?
Let me make a couple of points. First on startups, I think one of the truisms here is that they actually create wealth and jobs. Mr. Kasser and I were talking about this before. It might be smarter to focus on slightly more established businesses and take them from the mid cap into the big cap. That really what typically changes economies. The second point I wanted to make, in relation to, what have any of us want? And we're investors predominantly in the consumer space in India. On the margin, changes in slabs, business tax, kind of short-term helpful. I'm slightly with Mr. Modi in the sense that, SOPs and handouts, I think he said, are undignified. But you can't have it both ways. So the thing I'm looking for here is if there are no SOPs and handouts, that's fine. But let's have a very, very clear vision for the next 5 or 6 years. Yeah.
Sure.
So I think fine. Don't have those things, but let's hear about health. Let's hear about infrastructure. Let's hear a clear plan. And I'm not sure that we've heard that in the budget.
Sure.
Yet. Well, speaking as a foreign investor, I mean, of course, foreign banks would dearly love to get in the mix in India, which I think is highly unlikely to happen. Anytime soon. Look, I can't, whether it's banks or the auto sector or any sector you care to mention, Palki, I keep coming back to a basic thing, which is government is often the least well qualified entity to provide the direction. If you take, so let's draw a comparison. If you take Margaret Thatcher, who came to power in the UK in 1979, she wasn't from a business background, albeit her father was a grocer, I think. But what she actually did was she set about the civil service and regulations with a great big stick. And then she proceeded to privatise entities because she understood that actually only through competitive forces would the entities change. So I think whichever sector you look at here, a healthy dose of deregulation.
She took on Arthur Scargill. I was posted in London.
Well,
there's a labor, he was a labor leader of the whole country would stop if he gave a signal, and she took him on.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think her genius was in the destruction of rules, not the execution of rules.
Any surprises for you? Anything that stood out particularly that you did not expect would be there?
No particular surprises. I mean, I think so-called Modi care to an extent. But I think we were talking before, Palki, about this being an exercise in appealing to the voter base. And post Gujarat, it's very clear that there's disenchantment in the rural areas. So Mr. Jaitley leading off on a whole kind of package of agrarian reforms and incentives is no particular surprise. I think Mr. Modi's made good on the promise of no sops and giveaways. So there are no kind of cheap stunts in there, but nonetheless, everyone.
No change in tax slabs.
No change in tax slabs. I think probably the calculus there is that the marginal benefits from the electorate perspective are not worth being accused of sops, as they're called. I think if I look at it, there's something for everybody, right? And that smacks of populism, at least in an electoral sense.
Is there something for everyone? Ease of doing business and evaluation of performance under this program is to be based on user feedback. Essentially, he's trying to say that that is going to be one of the focus areas. I wanted to comment on that, and also whatever has been said or done about FDI or bringing in more money.
Well, 3 cheers for you know, I don't know if 372 is a big number or a small number. It sounds like a big number. I think, as ever with these things, handsome is as handsome does. So let's see those. Let's see implementation on that front. As far as FDI goes, yeah, absolutely. I agree with the previous commentator that sector by sector, there's a lot of positive noises. Frankly, I think the biggest thing that anyone who's serious about India will be looking for is continuity, right? And continuity this morning is measured in 2 ways. One, a budget that doesn't tank the markets or freak everyone out, right? And so far, so good. And the other one is something that, on the balance of probability, increases Mr. Modi's chances of winning a second term. Because we've said all along here, the weapons grade reform agenda of India is going to take years and years and years. So if you're interested in FDI, you're looking at 10, 20 years, not whether there's a SOP in a certain sector. So I think it's pretty positive like that. But let's see about execution. It's a very executionally intensive budget. It's a great time to do it in the sense of you ain't going to execute much of it in the next year before the election. So the consequences of this will only really be felt in the next electoral cycle.
As not a part of what the general budget is, it's seen for a higher purpose, as it were.
Well, whether 7% or 17% is the right number, who knows? He's bumped it up a bit. No doubt that will satisfy the armed forces one way or another, and will tick a box. That we continue to be protected, and some investment goes into the various branches of the military. So I sort of call that a neutral item, really.
Jasper, I'll come to you first. There was a lot of expectations riding on this budget for people like me, salaried individuals. But there's also this big question of the elections coming up. Do you think that the budget has met the expectations of everyone who was sort of keyed into looking at the speech this morning?
That's a good question, Aisha. I think the everyone you're referring to, if you're Narendra Modi and the BJP, the everyone that will affect your vote coming up, possibly even this year, frankly. So,
yes.
This close to any election, it's all driven by electoral calculus, and effectively the policies are reverse engineered out of that. So I think it's no wonder that we've seen a bias towards the rural sector. The message was loud and clear coming out of Gujarat that there was disaffection there. So they need to shore that part of the voter base up. As far as sort of people like you go in the salaried classes, I suppose my observation here is that there's been a lot of crimping today, that there haven't been many SOPs or rewards. But I suppose the calculus there is that enough has been done so far to secure enough of that vote to get through this year or in 2019. So I think it's an expedient budget. I wouldn't necessarily call it a political budget, because I don't think there's anything in there that isn't sensible. And the last point I'd make, which is a very obvious point, is handsome is as handsome does. This is executionally tremendously intensive.
Absolutely.
And it's one thing to declare Namo care or Modi care. It's another thing to execute it. So let's wait and see.
Jasper, the trust deficit that Meera Sanyal brought up, that's I suppose in some ways a bigger deficit to fill than the fiscal one, because the expectations of 1 billion plus Indians are riding on this budget. It comes at a time when the elections are just around the corner. So keeping that in mind and looking at what Parag just told us as somebody who works in the rural sector, the challenges were many for the finance minister, but has that gap been bridged in some ways?
Well, I think 3 cheers for Meera for raising the point that this is a very serious moment for the administration. So every new administration, and let's not forget Mr. Modi is a fresher in terms of the role, deserves a certain amount of time to settle in.
Mm-hmm.
But the rubber's now about to hit the road, and I think where I'm confused is there is no end of policies, there is no end of constituencies addressed by this. And I'm with Ron in the sense that by and large, it's optimistic, it's positive, and we all should be positive. But it's very unclear at this stage of the game how all of these activities actually join up into a cohesive strategy.
Right.
And I think here, if Mira in her job as CEO of RBS was to present a strategy based on a shopping list of various things, I think she'd be shouted down very quickly by her board. So I think now these items may or may not be beneficial, but we need to understand how they all join up, what the priorities are, and what the overall strategy is for this massive exercise in reform. And I think the administration now would do very well to heed the warnings of Mira and sit down and carefully understand how they're going to execute this stuff, because there ain't going to be a second chance now.
Jasper, that's interesting. I've got just enough time for a very quick reaction from you on that.
I think in the end, at this stage of the game, probably the answer to everything is to a certain extent humility. And I would hope that underneath all of this, there's a recognition of the administration that this is the mother of all tasks and must be approached with the utmost humility and knowledge that it takes time and it's hard.